Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Maureen Weinberger, and I am the chair of Poverty Free Halton, which is a nonpartisan citizens group raising awareness of poverty in the Halton region. Poverty Free Halton is sponsoring tonight's event. I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. We recognize the complexity and privilege of gathering online today by sharing a digital land acknowledgement written by Adrian Wong of Spiderweb Show in Ontario and adapted for this presentation. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I am currently is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabeg. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Since our activities are shared digitally to the internet, let us take a moment to acknowledge the legacy of colonization embedded within the technologies, structures, and ways of thinking we use every day. We are using equipment and high-speed internet not readily available in many Indigenous and marginalized communities. We are invited to join in acknowledging our shared responsibility to make good use of this time, and for each of us to consider our roles in reconciliation, decolonization, and allyship. We strive to ensure that our social justice and equity-seeking work will honor our commitments of truth and reconciliation to our First Peoples and the original stewards of this land. I would like to thank the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario and ETFO Halton for their financial support of Poverty Free Halton, and the Oakville and District Labour Council and Advancement of Women Halton for partnering with us in tonight's event. And of course, none of this would be happening tonight without the wonderful behind-the-scenes technology support of Kirsten Webb, Samantha Richardson, and Jillian Surrett Robinson from the United Way, Halton Hamilton. You see on your screen an outline of the agenda for this evening, and there are a couple of housekeeping items that I'd like to highlight. If you need any tech assistance for any reason whatsoever, please use the chat function, which is at the bottom of the screen. You just have to hover over there and you'll see the chat function, and you can contact Kirsten, Samantha, or Jillian, and they will be happy to help you. If you have any questions for the panelists, and we certainly hope that you will, please use the Q&A function, which is also on a button at the bottom of the screen when you hover over it, to ask those questions. As you can see from the agenda, we are going to have a question and answer section after the presentation from our panelists. So panelists will not be answering live while they're presenting. We will be collecting the questions and asking them to the panelists once they have finished their presentation. And now to hear from our esteemed guests. It gives me great pleasure to introduce three members of the Marvin Novan Legacy Group. Marvin Novick was a leading thinker and contributor to the social policy field in Ontario and Canada. He was a visionary and prescient. He wrote major national reports on child poverty in Canada, conducted a pioneering study on changing social conditions in Toronto suburbs, addressed issues of employment, focused public attention on the need for cross-community alliances to build inclusive communities, and importantly, advocated that governments assume their responsibilities to meet human needs. Before his death in 2016, Marvin had been exploring the challenge to create the commons as a response to neoliberalism and the need to recognize the inherent dignity and worth of all human persons. The Marvin Novick Legacy Group was formed and continues to pursue the ideas and activities to which he was committed. In November of 2019, the Legacy Group organized a conference focusing on the social commons. Emerging from this event was a clear desire to understand the commons and the social commons in a Canadian context. Joey, Peter, and David are here to share with us this conversation on their thinking on the power of the commons to transform our communities into socially just and ecologically sustainable places. Dr. Joey Edward is the former executive director at Community Development Halton. Dr. Edward's career has been dedicated to work in social and health services, social research, policy analysis, and community development, both in Canada and internationally. She has a wealth of experience in a range of service, planning, and advocacy organizations that include grassroots community organizations, agencies of the nonprofit sector, universities, municipal government, and the United Nations. She has written and spoken extensively on active aging, issues of poverty and inequality, and the social implications of a fraying health and social services infrastructure. Born in Alberta, she studied at Syracuse University in the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs, where she earned her doctorate in human geography and a certificate in gerontology. She also held a National Health and Welfare Canada postdoctoral fellowship to investigate comparative health systems. Joey, if you would like to say hello. Oh, you have to unmute.
Good evening. So, good evening, and I am here with my colleagues today to engage you in a conversation about a path that we've been traveling to find alternatives to the world of today. This world of ours marked by poverty, inequality, human exploitation, broken systems of social protection, and ecological degradation that simply threatens life on our planet. As the women of Advancement of Women Halton have said, we do not want to return to the old normal. The Legacy Group also does not want to turn to the old normal. So we began to study, to explore and imagine a paradigm, the commons, that frame a transition to a different way of thinking, of living, acting, participating, sharing, governing. Why the reemergence of the commons now? The paradigm and practices of the commons connects with history, with other worldviews, and all the anthropological evidence that demonstrate humans are social creatures, creatures that live in community, co-creating, sharing resources, and respecting Mother Earth. The commons have existed through time, across cultures, and across geographies. Most recently, in the World Social Forum of 2013, the commons arose as a paradigm to rethink the transition to a socially just and ecologically sustainable way of living. And why? So I would like my first slide, please. The commons emerges repudiating global capitalism and its neoliberal doctrine of austerity for the following reasons. Can people see the slide? Perfect. So why would we see the reemergence of the commons? Well, we see that we have been driven by market forces giving primacy to economic growth and corporate profit, that we've undermined our commitment to universal high quality public services for the benefit of all, narrowing social protection to conditional policies of control and risk management of the poor and marginal. We have commodified and privatized the profitable social services such as elder care, child care, and we have shifted the tax burden from corporations to individuals. So if we, so I would move on now from that slide. Sorry, this is just very interesting for me here. We're playing with technology that's new to some of us. So then I asked the question, what do we understand as the commons? But the first thing I'd like to talk about in the commons is human and collective rights are foundational to the commons. Human rights express what all humanity has in common, that is our universal human needs. Human rights guide the commons based on shared values of, say, mutual respect and dignity, values of inclusion, trust, obligation and responsibility, and equality. They are articulated in the United Nations Universal Declaration on Human Rights and associated covenants. Individual human rights are embedded in collective rights, as the individual, the human, cannot exist without society. These documents recognize, and this is very important to the commons, they recognize the inherent dignity and inalienable rights of all members of the human family. Human and collective rights are indivisible and further intertwined with what we call a third level of rights, environmental rights, designed to protect the life on the planet. So underpinned by human rights, the commons offer a framework for reimagining, for reimagining, for reorganizing our economy, our social relations, and our democratic institutions. So what is the commons? What is the alternative? The commons refer to the resources that are life's necessities, that are common to all, that should be shared by all and controlled by all. The commons are a cooperative way of living, concerned with the reproduction of resources for sustainability and not their depletion. It is the equitable pooling of resources, collectively governed for fair access for all. The commons can also be viewed as living social systems through which people generate the necessities of life, essential to sustainability, and address their shared problems in self-organized, peer-to-peer ways in their communities. The commons in any setting take shape by processes of the engagement of people in governance, provisioning, and social practice. Six spheres of the commons, essential for human well-being, have been identified. All are interconnected, interlocked, interdependent. All represent areas that people see as being held in common, belonging to all of us. These commons include rules for governing, regulating, and monitoring their use. Could I please have the next slide? You will see the natural commons, the right to use and live in harmony with natural resources such as land, water, air, forests. Humankind is of nature. We are part of nature, not separate from nature. The social commons, the right to create relationships, activities, systems of social protection and support, through which we respect and help each other participate and flourish. The civil commons, the right to justice that's universal, proportionate, and based on due process and equality before the law. David will speak more fully on the role of the state, which we refer to as the emancipatory state. I would have the next slide, please. The cultural commons, the right to cultural resources. The arts can widen horizons, expand perceptions, question presumptions, and encourage empathy, as well as pleasure and delight. The knowledge commons. Just think, the knowledge commons, the right to access information, education, ideas, science, knowledge. And then the economic commons, our last sphere. And there could be other spheres as we develop our thinking and dialogue. But the economic commons, the creation of an economy for people and their needs. The spheres of the commons and their interrelated functioning contribute to building an economy that is regenerative, distributive, and that works within Mother Earth's ecological limits. And Peter is going to develop that further in his remarks. I'm just going to take a minute to talk about the social commons, kind of where I think I place myself. But the social commons focus on meeting basic human needs through an innovative system of social protection, again, based on human rights and reflective of the needs and the reality of the 21st century. Human needs are complex and interconnected. To provide one and leave others unfulfilled or unattended creates gaps in our systems affecting, as we all know, human health and well-being. It is in the collaborative partnership with the state, civil society, and communities that the design and implementation of a system of social protection occurs. This co-creation flows from the active and democratic participation of people in local communities, the active and democratic participation of people in local communities who fully understand their needs and the way that they can be met. It is in local communities that local autonomy and self-determination rebalances power relations with the structure of the state. The social commons rights-based approach to a system of social protection would be inclusive, for example, of a strongly co-designed public services in health, education, social care, elder care, child care, affordable, stable, safe housing, full employment, decent work and benefits, adequate living incomes for all, the establishment of a floor below which no one falls, and also an emancipatory state as an indispensable partner in the co-creation, managing, and monitoring of a 21st century system of social protection. And let's not forget, the social commons turns our attention to the reward of social relations, of belonging, of participating, and of connecting to one's shared humanity through life in community. Embracing the social commons is a path that leads to an alternative to the automization, the individualization, the materialism, and the marginalization of the present. So I would now like to give the floor to David, or the Zoom to David.
First me. Okay, so it is my pleasure to introduce David Thornley, who is a policy advisor at the Social Planning Network of Ontario. David has worked in both government and the community sector and has a deep understanding of the social policy and research issues concerning social assistance, income security, community health, and affordable housing. He has held senior leadership positions in several direct service organizations, including Executive Director of 2 community health centers, Guelph, East End, and Toronto, Executive Director of Knowledge Ontario, Provincial Projects Coordinator for Ontario's Community Health Centres, Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care, Program Director, Toronto Social Planning Council. As a volunteer leader, he served as founder of the Parkdale Community Health Centre and First Step Nonprofit Homes, which focuses on homeless persons and refugees. As president, Runnymede Adventure Club before and after school program, board member, Ontario Health Coalition. David has a lifelong commitment to the issues of social inclusion, adequate income, and equitable access to service. David?
Thank you very much. I'm going to build a bit on some of the things that Joey said, and then talk about the 5 pillars. One of the struggles that we've had as a group is trying to think in terms of how do we take the many ideas about the commons as they are manifesting themselves and as different people are talking about them, and create a coherent foundation upon which we can then link and propagate ideas into something that resembles a coherent framework. So our attempt at distilling down to 5 pillars is our attempt to create that foundation. So to begin with, the understanding of the commons, to very briefly summarize some of the points made in Joey's remarks, it's a cooperative way of living. It's about an equitable pooling of resources which are collectively governed in terms of fair access for all. It's about a living social system through which people generate the necessities of life, and it seeks to live in harmony with nature and within the ecological limits of our environment. Our conception of the social commons is embedded or anchored in 5 pillars, which we believe work in concert and mutually reinforce each other. They form the foundation in supporting and enabling the kinds of systems transformations which we think are urgently needed. The first one is about ensuring rights and equitable access. I'm not going to cover the social commons one. Thank you. More generally, because I think Joey has already done that one justice. So the other 5 pillars within that are ensuring rights and equitable access, ensuring everyone both economic and social security through individual and collective rights that allow each of us to flourish and thrive. The social commons provides a justice framework for rethinking social, economic, and environmental policies, which is equitable and inclusive, and we think transformative. It ensures that the resources of the commons are protected by government and are available to and able to be shared by all. The second pillar, social rights and protections, and Joey spoke at length about that, but it is a critical piece that cultures the world over are underpinned by a core set of universal values and strong bonds to what we owe each other. And these values assert our obligations in terms of ensuring freedom from want and fear and sharing abundance fairly. We are guided by central questions. What is the path to greater social and environmental justice? And which paths will best address the enduring human needs for home, for community, for economic security, and for contribution and good work? The third pillar, a human needs economy. And I'm going to just cover that one very, very briefly, because in the presentation from Peter, I think he is going to go into that one in much more detail. But it's the notion that our economy needs to be organized around what people need locally as people, families, and groups living in human community. And it needs to be a partnership with private businesses, governments, nonprofit organizations embedded within community life, all working as part of civil society to create vibrant and sustainable places where everyone can thrive and share in prosperity. A critical piece for us moving to the next one is about deepening democracy and strengthening civil society, because everything that we are talking about is dependent on a reciprocal relationship to what we're calling the emancipatory state, which I'll speak to in a subsequent presentation, and civil society. To make the transition from all of the challenges of our neoliberal framework and to transition to the emancipatory state is an essential pillar in enabling the creation of the social commons. Public institutions must act as stewards of people's rights and partner in creating the social, economic, and ecological conditions for both human well-being and the sustainability of the planet. The final one is none of this is going to work unless, in addition to sustainable communities, we also have sustainable ecosystems. So as part of the commons, we need to live in harmony with nature, and that is consistent with an indigenous worldview, which exists in many parts of the world, that sees us as having responsibility not for simply our own life and well-being, but for that of many generations to come. And we believe that human and social rights, as Joey said, are intertwined with a third level of rights, environmental rights, designed to protect all life on this planet. These are the pillars that we think are critical in framing and underpinning our choices, because our current systems are failing us. These pillars stand out in stark contrast to the drivers of public policy in our current systems and the clear and mounting evidence that these systems are making things worse too often rather than better. Neoliberalism as an ideology often puts the state and its institutions at the service of global capital rather than safeguarding human rights, providing adequate social protection, and ensuring our ecological foundation. Four destructive fallacies are underlying our current approach to economic growth in neoliberalism, and these are that we can somehow continue and even accelerate the damage to our ecosystems and natural habitats upon which all life on the planet depends without exhausting the Earth's finite resources, potentially in a matter of only a few decades. That somehow loans from banks to foster economic growth are the foundation of human progress, while investments by government in both physical and social infrastructure and in creating caring communities are a drain on the economy. that the free flow of financial capital internationally to jurisdictions with lower taxation, lower labor costs, reduced workplace and environmental standards produces global economic progress rather than labor exploitation, ecological damage, and increasing inequities of both income and wealth. And finally, that our future creativity, innovation, and culture and scientific knowledge are best propagated and advanced through an entrenched system of proprietary accumulation, rather than a system which views science and knowledge as a cultural inheritance, a form of intergenerational reciprocity, encouraging the free flow of ideas and acting as the springboard for creativity, innovation, and future prosperity. To move from the world we inhabit to the world we want to create will require a new way forward, one that thinks about and values things quite differently, one that places addressing human needs more equitably and within ecological limits at the center, and puts these goals above corporate wealth accumulation. We must change our development practices and consumption patterns to focus efforts on reducing ecological damage and waste that threatens the very survival of the planet. We must expand our conception of social protections to include a thriving social commons with investments in caring and green local economies. We must focus political and economic rights and activities on ensuring that everyone can meet the basic necessities of life and can achieve full participation, both economically and democratically, in their communities. We must reverse policies that enable corporations and those who control them to amass vast wealth, while many of the Earth's inhabitants are denied access to the basic necessities of life, and that provide decent sustaining work through ensuring and safeguarding fundamental human and civil rights. And finally, we must significantly constrain the private appropriation and hoarding of cultural, intellectual, and scientific knowledge of past generations, which excludes access to them for current and future generations to build the kind of solutions and future that we need. To summarize, the social commons focuses on human health and well-being, living in harmony with nature, and ensuring that everyone both economically and has both economic and social security through individual and collective rights that allow us each to flourish and thrive. A critical part of this is strengthening the civil society itself as active agents that give meaning and legitimacy to policies and programs funded and enabled by all levels of government. In particular, the social commons provides a justice framework for rethinking our social relationships, economic and environmental policies, which are equitable, inclusive, and community-driven. Growing the social commons through the goals and actions framed by these pillars is designed to bring this vision to life. Thank you. And I'm going to turn over to Peter.
So it's my pleasure to introduce Peter Clutterbuck. And just to let you know, when Peter is finished, all three of the panelists will be back on again just to add some detail to what they have already said to us. Peter Clutterbuck was the coordinator at the Social Planning Network of Ontario, 2001 to 2019. Now retired, Peter Clutterbuck worked in the nonprofit human services sector for more than 45 years. He has worked in the fields of disability, mental health, health promotion, affordable housing, and social planning. Peter has a long association with social planning, starting with special project work for the Social Planning Council of Metro Toronto, SPCMT, in the early 1980s, and returning in 1991 to head up the SPCMT until 1998, when he became a co-director of the new Amalgamated Community Social Planning Council of Toronto. From 2000 to 2020, Peter combined a program development and project coordination role for the Social Planning Network of Ontario, the SPNO, with independent consulting in the nonprofit sector with community-based agencies across the province of Ontario. Peter?
Hi, thanks a lot, Maureen. I'm sorry I can't be there in living motion, but maybe that's to your benefit. Anyway, when people talk about the social commons within that set of other spheres, they often assume that just means the new version of the welfare state, or what the next version of social protection would be. And it's not got much to do with the economy, but in fact, what's most important about the social commons is that it must be very directly linked to the economy. In fact, the economy must become somewhat serving of some of our needs and interests in the other areas of the commons. The Karl Polanyi, an Austrian economic historian in the 40s, in his Great Transformation book, actually pointed out that, in fact, it wasn't always that the economy was so market-driven or all about profit. In fact, it used to be in traditional societies embedded in the social relations of community life. And there was a recognition among leaders in community who had some influence that there was a collective interest in producing what was needed for the community to survive and thrive, not profit and gain. And he points out that marketization took over around the time of the Industrial Revolution, and profit and competition dominated, and the social field was more or less left to react to what he called the double movement to that and devise ways for social protection of mostly workers. So in the 1940s, he was pointing out we need to go in another direction to re-embed the economy in our social relations. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in '48 really did assert the collective interest of the human family for health and well-being, at least aspirationally. It has talked about, it said articles around economic security and stability for all, the right to a decent standard of living, freedom from fear and want, the right to employment and other necessary social protections, a natural development from the years of the Great Depression and the war, when leadership recognized that the people would really not put up with the kind of conditions they've been living with over the preceding 15 or 20 years. So it did offer this kind of new way of thinking about the social and economic needs of the community. It didn't totally kind of embed them, but it did talk about the importance of full employment and the benefits that would arise. And the governments had a responsibility for developing things like social insurances, family allowances, investment in housing, health, and education. Basically, the basis of the welfare state, which was a social contract that really prevailed for 30 years. And there were major reports written, the Marsh Report here in Canada, the Beveridge Report in the UK, which really established the framework for a welfare state that did really work, mostly labor, business, and government, recognizing they were mutual partners around reconstructing, creating a society that had the lowest levels of inequality over the preceding 2 centuries. But also in the 1940s, it was the birth of neoliberalism, as David and Joey have pointed out. It gave primacy to the free market as the source of wealth, creation, and economic growth. And it really did intentionally work to separate economic activity from social needs, and to more or less equate economic activity as the market. The market should dominate. Milton Friedman of the Chicago School being a main proponent. Individual over collective interest. Competition and individual gain valued above all. It promoted unregulated markets and minimal role for government. Market wealth trickles down to the workers, and the social needs are met by charity. The environment is exploited without regard for damage to planet and its species. Now, this might have emerged in the 1940s, but of course it really captured political and economic thought in the 1980s. People like Reagan and Thatcher. And if you've read Naomi Klein's Shock Doctrine, how essentially the Chicago schools, neoliberalism was exported to South America, to Europe, even to Russia, and really established in the public's mind, the way we think about the economy is, it's over on one side, it's all about the market. The economy equals the market, and social needs are residual and separate from that. And the social commons framework is trying to, it really does depend on reintegrating the economic with the social, but also to more recognize than we used to, the importance of the natural environment. Re-embedding the economy into society, making the economy of service to society, making it of service to society and not destroying the environment. After all, the purpose of economic activity, to think about the purpose of the economy, economic activity should really be about using our resources to meet the needs that sustain life. It should not be about perpetual growth, accumulation of wealth in one part of the society and not another. Now, if you talk about an environmentally sustainable human needs economy, it's necessary to discard this traditional notion of market-dominated model that depends on unachievable perpetual growth and move to what's called a circular economic model. And I see in the Q&As, one of you have anticipated something that we want to show you. A way of looking at the economy differently that provides stability and security to the living needs of all, and respects the environmental limits to life-sustaining human activity. So yes, we have looked and been very fascinated by and studying Kate Raworth, she's a British economist, her donut economic model. This first slide shows kind of the ideal model for the way the economy should work and what it should include. And it's not a line that starts at the left-hand side of a graph and starts to grow to the right-hand side of the graph exponentially to show GDP increasing year over year over year. Rather, it's looking at how to create adequate standards of living, decent standards of living within the means that we have available, the kind of resources that are available to us, but also respect the bounds of our ecology, our environment. So you see here that she establishes a social foundation that meets human needs on the inside. If you recognize, many of you I know would be familiar with the social determinants of health. And that social foundation is made up of all the basic necessities of life, but also not just how to survive, but how to thrive, how to recognize equity, how to give people political voice, how to have peace and justice among us. And that, the question is, how much of our society, not only in Canada, but around the world, really have the standards necessary to meet those requirements. But at the same time, recognizing an economy has to develop the capacity to meet these needs on the inside of that donut. At the same time, it must respect the outer ceiling, things like climate change, the oceans, biodiversity loss, land conversion. And you'll notice that that arrow says we can be short on the inside, not meeting needs for people in everyday living, and we can really develop the market and the economy as we have been over the last number of years and overshoot the ecological limits. So the next slide actually shows what Kate Raworth and her colleagues say is the state of our situation right now. She kind of has used some measures to show that those encroachments on the social foundation into the center show how far short we are in all those areas that are so important in the social determinants of health, the state of our world now. And the outer ring shows essentially measurable areas in the darker colors where we can actually measure what damage you're doing to climate change and biodiversity loss. And there's other evidence in those other spheres as well that we're putting too much pressure in the way our economy is going now to be able to create that sustainable circular model that you talked about before, that I showed before. So the circular model embeds the economy and society more widely, and it frees it from the myth of a self-contained, self-sustained market. It no longer defines the economy as a market. It defines the economy as the human activity necessary to use the resources available to us, materials, land, capital, labor, time, expertise, skills, to be able to meet human needs and respect the ecological limits of our existence on this planet. So my last slide really does point to what Raworth calls the four realms. Essentially, what should drive the economy rather than how should we think about the market in relation to the overall economy rather than let the market define the economy. Just a quote from Raworth before around this particular slide that's created from her work. She says, instead of immediately focusing on making markets work more efficiently, we can start by considering when is each of the four realms of provisioning, household, commons, market, and state, best suited to delivering humanity's diverse wants and needs. So she actually identifies the household as the core of the economy, the unpaid reproductive work that's done every day, mostly by women, that sustains the essentials of family and social life with the universal human resources of time, knowledge, skill, care, empathy, teaching, and reciprocity. Raworth contends, and we would agree, and the social commons framework would definitely agree with this, that essentially this should be thought of as part of the economy, that kind of household contribution to our everyday human activity that sustains human life. The market has its place. It is powerful and efficient. It does produce and distribute private goods and services, but it measures all its value by price and return on investment. And its dynamics actually widen inequalities, as we saw since the 1980s, growing inequality. And so it does require some regulation and control. It's not that it doesn't have a contribution to make. It's one of those partners that David talked about, but it shouldn't be the driving force for the whole economy. And then the commons. This is the creative sector. This is the sector where we share the resources of nature, society, that people choose to use and to govern through self-organizing instead of relying on the state or market for doing so. And this is a particular challenge for us who are in the progressive end of things around how our society should work. Because it kind of sounds like everything happens at the community level. Everything's about little local activity rather than larger responsibilities to our members in other communities and in our nation. It can compete with the market, but also when the market finds its profitable areas in the commons, of course, it will encroach as it did originally way back in the post-feudal society. So the commons is the creative sector, and the state is an essential, this is social commons thinking, Raworth's thinking, essential supporter, not a driver of the other policy realms. It empowers households, providing supports as necessary. For example, spending power and the ability to survive over the last year and a half or so with direct transfers to people to make sure that they didn't really suffer tremendously from basic access to food and rent. Enables collaborative potential of the commons and regulates the market to ensure the public good, probably most important. And our real challenge, we in the Marvin Novick Legacy Group, is to figure out that relationship especially. I think we accept controlling the market, recognizing the household's role and unpaid work's role is not valued enough and recognized enough. But the real challenge for us is thinking, how do we have that relationship between the commons and the state that makes sure there are things like national programs and national standards of care for people, and at the same time allow at the local level communities to start to design and develop approaches that are suitable to their particular conditions. And that is a real challenge, because what is the link between the commons and how it works at the local level and the state and how it provides the necessary public policy frameworks and resource supports to essentially liberate the commons to do the kind of provisioning that their communities want. So that's essentially all I have to say right now. I think David might be giving an example of what the emancipatory state is next, right, David?
So it's back to me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to try at a very high level to talk about the emancipatory state, which to most people is going to be, what? What's that about? So I'm going to do two things. I'm going to give you an overview of what we mean by the concept of the emancipatory state and outline some of the ways in which it's quite different from what many people might see or think about as the role of governments generally. The second thing that I want to do is attempt to surface the interdependence or interrelationship of this concept with our related efforts to build a deeper democracy, including the strengthening of the commons as the foundation of community life and civil society. Okay, so what do we mean by the emancipatory state and how does it behave differently? For us, it means nothing less than a fundamental rethinking of the role of government, from one framed around unleashing the power of global capital to one grounded much more in freeing people and communities to shape their own futures with supports both from markets and government and nonprofit organizations. The emancipatory state would build on its historical role in public provision of common goods, in leading and supporting research and innovation, in risk-taking sometimes, even entrepreneurship, and as it always has, in nation building, in creating the platforms and the foundations of at a sufficient scale that the people acting locally and within districts can work within. In short, more framing and enabling, less program administration and bureaucratic procedures, more community building resources, more tools and protective measures, and less market-driven solutions, more local design flexibility and less sector funding with detailed program criteria. It starts from the premise that local actors dealing with real situations on the ground are in a better position to figure out how to solve, in an implementation sense, the problems that they face, and government needs to guide, support, and enable those processes rather than thinking it has the answers to the problems. At its core, the newly conceived emancipatory state would be expected to play an essential enabling role in fostering and safeguarding the social commons, including, as I think we mentioned earlier, acting as a steward of people's rights and a partner in creating the social, economic, and ecological conditions for respecting, endorsing, and enacting these rights. shifting senior governments from program administrators to outcome enablers and genuine partners in the initiatives of civil society, with clear role in standard setting, in ensuring resources are allocated fairly, and that decisions and outcomes are grounded in and produce equitable results which benefit everyone. It also requires new social programs designed to ensure that everyone can meet the basic necessities of life, have access to sufficient resources and opportunities to achieve an acceptable community standard of living. But it also means creating social programs and approaches which are about community building itself. It also means, though, strengthening international governance and democracy to tackle those global problems that exist and which can't all be solved by local areas in isolation through clear targets and binding commitments. It means enabling and facilitating local communities of actors to find their own solutions and ways of solving problems within a protective and supportive social and economic policy framework designed to build and extend the resources of the commons. Strong social rights and social protections delivered through senior governments consistent with UN declarations and cultural and political rights has to be also part of what an emancipatory state ensures. So what we're left with is a legal framework that asserts the primacy of human rights, ecological sustainability, and a community building, and which makes private corporate interests subservient to meeting human needs and holds them accountable for doing so. All the institutions of democracy will count for little if our economies remain under the control of political and economic elites. We need to have more say in economic decision-making and to have a direct voice in how political decisions are made, particularly those which directly affect our lives, rather than having these choices determined by others on our behalf and having some folks whose rights are eroded or denied based on their social or economic status. We need to transition to a post-growth economy focused on a better distribution of the abundance that nature provides us with and that we can generate for use by all. This must be grounded in the provision of quality essential services that can be equitably accessed and the ability of all to participate in the management of our shared resources through a rebuilding of the commons and a democratizing of our communities and workplaces. So what does this mean in terms of civil society and the role and our concept of deepening democracy, which is also an important element here. So the heart of enabling a deepening of democracy means that the role of governments at all levels must be refocused on both community building and ecological survival, and our political and economic institutions reshaped and embedded within that framework. This will require transformative changes in at least 5 areas. Governance and program design focused on community needs and local aspirations, local resource banks and deliberative decision-making bodies that give communities both voice and control over significant local decisions, ensuring that social rights and protections are delivered through an emancipatory state that fully addresses the basic necessities of life for everyone. A more democratized economy where private markets are embedded within a community building, goods creation, resource sharing and distributing system, and finally social and economic institutions designed to work within the carrying capacity of our ecological systems at a district, region, and national level. Taken together, these changes would dramatically reshape society in ways that build solidarity, trust, community, and a deeper democracy that improves both well-being and prosperity. Clearly, this is an enormous undertaking and one grounded in a host of broader policies. Realistically, it will take a generation or longer to put fully in place. We're not naive about that, but many of the ideas needed to support such approaches are already being tested out and propagated in communities across the globe, including circular economics and the donut, which was just talked about a moment ago by Peter. Other ideas rooted in ecological sustainability and driven by climate change, like net zero carbon have become both more expansive and more clearly focused over the last decade. But to push our political leaders into action and to change our institutional structures, we will need the groundswell of voices from civil society. We need to see democracy and community building as a process that has equity, inclusion, and participation at its heart and is open to all. We need to create stronger links between community level democratic participation and policymaking by senior governments, more deliberative democracy and things like citizens' assemblies. We need more direct democracy, provided there are safeguards against abuses of power by majorities and the manipulation of instruments of direct democracy by political leaders. In short, we need much more community level participation, including devolved governance and resource allocation decisions, which allow local communities to develop their own grounded solutions to the challenges that they face. I can give some examples and illustrations in specific areas, but I think I'll leave that for the Q&A. Thank you.
So I think it's my turn now
Right.
I was going to talk a little bit about the implications from the vantage point of the social commons about childcare. And I guess tonight I have the privilege of addressing this issue with many of the people that I know are on this call. And actually, I don't know if you do this on Zoom calls, but I want to raise a toast to the women and to the people across our community who have worked for decades to put in place a universal, quality, affordable, publicly funded childcare program. And we heard the best of news last night in our federal budget. Actually, a tear of joy went down my cheek. I think of joy and quasi-disbelief, but it has been a long struggle and it's not over. We will monitor it, but I must say, this is for all of you as you're sitting listening about the commons in your homes, a toast for this extraordinary participation. And I do have a shout out for someone that I believe is on the call or on our Zoom, and we'll all know her. Her name is Laurel Rothman. And for years and years and years, Laurel has worked with Campaign 2000, worked on the issues of children, worked on the human rights of children in our society. And some of what we see happening in Ottawa, I attribute to her extraordinary struggle. In terms of the social commons, a program of universal social equality, affordable childcare fits perfectly in what a social commons perspective on social protection would be. And to this audience, I do not have to capture with much time the value of this type of program, both in terms of our investment in children, in their path to development and growth, enveloped in opportunities that will prepare them for a future, actually all our futures. The other, of course, is the role this kind of programming plays in gender equality, promoting gender equality, the role that it plays in supporting families who in the world that we live in today live with much of life's stresses. It also supports economic development, facilitating women entering the labor force. We've all heard about the role of women, that this recovery from the pandemic that we're suffering is going to be a she recession with women returning to work. And then this universal, affordable, publicly funded childcare is part of our move to the caring economy. I will add, we have yet to see it in some other areas like basic income security or long-term care. And then I would say that such a program, childcare program, is again a partnership with the Emancipatory State, based on legislation, defined by principles and standards, and with long-term conditional funding. It's co-designed, monitored, and implemented at the local level, which allows people to embrace their diversity and unique circumstances to co-create, provide innovation, flexible childcare services that meet a local community's needs. So again, universal childcare would be an essential element of a system of social protection within the vision of the Commons. So again, a toast and a congratulations to the people on this call that have spent years working for our successes. So thank you.
Thanks, Joey. And here to that
Thank
toast. We wanted to, that the last few examples were given, we wanted to not just talk about the commons in kind of theoretical terms or analytic terms, but also to give some examples. In our monograph on our website, you'll see that we identify 4 or 5 key issues in our society, even before the pandemic struck, that need to be addressed in a different way than they have been traditionally, even traditionally in the social welfare state. And my particular interest is the area of senior care, elder care. I follow closely the Seniors of Social Action Ontario, participate occasionally around their letter writing campaigns. And clearly now, since the pandemic in its first year, 80% of its casual deaths were actually in long-term care here in Ontario. It's a totally inadequate public protection of a most vulnerable population. And I would say it's not just a question of government's inadequacy or provider inadequacy, it's a question of cultural inadequacy. We are actually allowing this to happen. We have to be accountable for the ageism that happens in our society and how it's reflected in how people are taken care of, or as opposed to actually engaged continually in a supportive way in community life. We have devalued people. The more they get from their productive years, and the more frail and requiring support that they, lack of independent living skills that they have over time. We allow this to happen. And the social commons critique certainly is about not allowing human services for people who are vulnerable, like people with disabilities or seniors, to be a source of private profit, certainly. But it's also about not allowing this to be a facility-based care model, an institutionally based care model. That there are more than enough of alternatives that have been demonstrated in North America as well as in Europe and other countries, that we can actually help people live comfortable, well supported, aging in place in their homes or in their communities until they die. That we can support their families to help people. We can support those households to provide the level of informal care that they can, and to introduce expertise that's necessary to support them in doing that, and giving them respite and giving them caregiving education models. We can do that. We can do if we have to. Let's face it, a lot of the people are going to be elder over the next 20 years. Since we have a high proportion of people living on their own now, they're not going to have families. They're going to need some kind of community living models that bring them together, or we could just discard them and put them off institutions, forgotten and isolated from everyone. But there are models for small scale, home-like community settings. And this is not just about supporting people in terms of their healthcare or basic needs. It's about, as much as possible, helping people to remain active and included in the community, to be actively engaged in community life, not just living in a setting somewhere or in a facility somewhere. So what does this actually mean when you think about this way of thinking about it? Well, here's what we're facing. We actually have discussion of a national standards for long-term care or elder care. And my fear is that this is just going to be about, standards that are facility-based standards, how to make our facilities perform more accountably and more transparently and more adequately to the needs of people. And this isn't what's needed. If we're going to have national standards, it should be national standards for a strategy that is about how to support as many seniors as possible to live their lives in their community until they die. And that means there's some responsibilities on households, the commons, the state, but not the markets, in my view anyway, to actually make that happen. But we actually to think about a serious social commons approach to really dealing with the issue of elder care over the next 10 years. There should be targets set, just like we set targets in the 1990s on reducing our deficit over a 4 or 5 year period and marked it year by year. There should be targets set for a 5 to 10 year plan to reduce referrals to long care institutions to 0. We should actually be intentionally trying to target a point at which we'll be forced to have developed an alternative system. Just like we're being forced to think about out of fossil fuels into a green economy, we should be doing the same thing around elder care. And the state should be providing the resources and the technical support to a range of community-based and family support and individualized funding models. And the commons, community-level organization, can create the planning mechanisms to design appropriate models for elders and families and communities that meets their health and well-being needs and also their social participation needs. And we have to think, you know, some most important progressive allies have been traditionally labor movement. We have to help labor movement figure out how we organize in this type of system in a way that that workers' rights are protected. Because just because when we give in the individualized services to people, I know because I've done this a lot in the disability movement, it doesn't mean workers don't have rights, and sometimes they are not respected, and sometimes they're you know, not treated well. And so there needs to be labor protection for workers in these systems as well. And households really have to be involved actively in the design and implementation. And why is this maybe just pie in the sky and not at this time? I don't think it is. Because the timeliness of this moment, when so many people have lost family members, that it's not just a question of numbers that people might take some interest in as they look after their own family member, but it's a question of feeling the loss of having someone die in long-term care or not being able to see them while they were sick for so many months. This had a major impact on families. It's been deeply felt. And there's a growing sense that we need to change this system, but we shouldn't be just changing it in terms of national standards that are about incremental reform and improvement. This is an opportunity to think about how to do real transformation. And it means government should be working with communities around models that communities can help design and implement, as well as both David and Joey indicated earlier.
I think we're ready for questions.
Yes. Okay, so here we go. So panelists, just to let you know, we're about 5 minutes in already into the time that we had allotted for this. So we're going to try and move along quickly because we are going to try and be finishing up about 8:30. None of the questions have been specifically asked of any of you, so feel free to just to jump in. So our first one, in a region such as Halton, where there does appear to be divide in the thinking with respect to equity and divergence of experience and understanding between the northern part of the region and the southern part of the region, a lack of leadership, what is the suggested path forward?
Since I'm the one that is living and working in Halton, I might tackle that a little bit. I think that there is a historical issue here, and history is always important in helping us provide a context. But Halton was a community of little towns. And in 1970, when I think it was then that the region of Halton was formed, it was to help provide some of those basic services to these little towns, the north being particularly rural, and the south building along the throughways going from Toronto to Hamilton into Niagara. What I believe is there has never been a force that has created a dialogue with the people that live in the respective communities to say, what kind of governance model do you want? And does it work for you? Does it interpret you? Does it allow you to suggest what's important for you? And I haven't seen that. I think it's, as David pointed out, a major failure of democratic processes in our area. We've not seen civic panels or civic assemblies to look at how we build a cohesive region, or if that's what we want. And if that's not what we want, if that doesn't serve our purposes, if it doesn't allow us to be innovative and flexible and meet human needs within a human rights perspective, then changes are needed. I do think when we talk about a divergence of opinions and values, we've long lost in our discourse in Canada, in Ontario, in our region, deep discussions of the most important issues that we face in our lives and how we respond to them, and the values, the important values we must share amongst ourselves and together. I hope that answers a little bit the question. And of course, leadership is paramount. And I think leadership is something paramount throughout our province.
Okay, thank you, Joey. The next one, there is discussion of the commons in South America. Has their experience influenced your thinking on the commons?
Joey, why don't you start that one too, since you have more experience there than I do?
Now, yes. Well, I think that, you know, Latin America suffered the ravages of structural adjustment in a way, the impact of global capitalism and neoliberalism in a way that we can only imagine, tearing societies apart. So they have for a long time been engaged in a powerful discourse about what development is about. Human development, development for people, development involving people. This is not the World Bank's version of development or poverty alleviation. And so there are powerful groups that we have had the privilege of contacting. And in fact, Francine Mestrom was here, and we're following their thinking. A number of us were recently involved in an amazingly powerful conversation in planning, in the social, the world's planning for the World Social Forum next year on social justice, with powerful opinions and research of our Latin American colleagues. So I see it as expanding our vision. I see an angry, extraordinarily well-informed group of people who are calling the question in a way that we don't yet. I do think we will grow by working closely with the links that we have established in Latin America. And those groups exist. We are in contact with them. So yes, that's the answer. We'll learn a lot from them.
Thanks, Joey. And I just want to let participants know that Peter Clutterbuck is still with us. Because he wasn't able to come in on video, we can't pin him on this spotlight, but he is available to answer questions. And so Peter, we know you'll jump in if you want to. Okay, next one. Do you see a path to reform that does not include a human rights action against the government?
David, Peter?
It would be helpful to get a little bit more context of that question. Is there a particular human rights action that the people are asking about?
That's what I have for the question,
Okay.
David, so.
Well, I mean, I agree with David's, the context, but very clearly the government of Canada through time has not, well, it may purport to be and has ratified many of the international conventions. It has in fact not lived up to its commitments. So unfortunately in Canada, we are a country of law. We respect our civil rights. We have in our own constitution and charter articulated the international documents on civil rights. We have not articulated clearly the social rights. And that will be what I believe will be the next journey that we have in this society, to clearly put our political and civil rights at the same level as our social rights and cultural rights.
I have a thought on this too. There are clear areas where the government has to be challenged, and it can be with human rights actions. There have been international or UN auditors, I think they're called, that have pointed to Canada's failings, especially on poverty reduction over many years. But you know what? I think we got to look to ourselves and in our communities. That you can take legal action, you can shout to the skies, but look around in your community, who's with you around what issue that needs really to be worked at. And we would argue from a social commons framework would be best. We have to look to ourselves to change some of these situations rather than kind of try to rely on legal frameworks that haven't really been honored adequately over the years and can take an awful lot of time when we could do a lot more. I'm working with a group of 8 people on a board right now, totally volunteers, that have made fantastic strides in our community of Oakwood Vaughan over the last year and a half in ways that I never would have imagined, just by the fact that we're committed to the particular issues affecting young people and tenants in our community. And I think all of us have to look to who are our allies around and what issues, and get down on the ground and start do it. And the other thing is we got to figure out that connection between what we're doing at the ground and what we expect of our policymakers in terms of legislative frameworks and providing resources available.
Great, thank you, Peter. Okay, next. I'm all about this framework, absolutely love it, but I'm having a hard time imagining where we would even start to adopt something like this, given how entrenched neoliberalism is. Thoughts on this? Do we overthrow the government, ending with an LOL? But I think that's a legitimate question. So,
well, I mean, I can start on that one. I mean, I think anything that seems overwhelming is because there's a lot of work involved, and on a lot of different issues at a lot of different levels. And so the question becomes, where do you start? And I know people don't like to hear it, but you start everywhere at once. And you see where people are interested in working, and you build small pieces of success, but you always build them within the context of a coherent frame. And so even though you end up with 1,000 different things going on all over the place, if you're able to see the 1,000 things all as part of 150 things that are all part of 5 foundational pieces for building the world that we want to create, and then you connect the dots so that people can see that these aren't really 1,000 little things. They're all evidence that we can get the job done. And so it's that challenge of, at what point in the civil rights movement did you have the critical mass that made certain things possible? You can always analyze it after the fact and find things, but in the moment that it's happening, you can't see it coming, and then it's all of a sudden it's there. And that's what's going to happen with this. It will build slowly. It'll take a lot of time, but 20 years ago, who would have thought people would have the idea of the circular economy, which is absolutely brilliant and a huge thing to organize around. So these kinds of ideas are surfacing. They're being tried out and tested all over the world. We're going to learn from things that work and which actually build momentum and go from there.
And also this moment is this post-pandemic moment, or getting through the pandemic moment, has really helped people recognize what social protection is about, what our responsibilities are to each other, about what we might expect of governments. It seems to me this is a moment like maybe the Great Depression was, around a whole different way of thinking about the role of government. Certainly the role of government in this time and its responsibilities to truly invest in people and support people is a lot different than even 5 years ago, where we're talking about deficit control and debt control. This is a moment when everything is loosened up, and that people have really had an experience over the last year and a half that is rooted in some of the inequalities or inequities in our society, and they see others experience the same. This is the time to really think, well, how do we change it? Not just because of an economic crisis or a pandemic crisis or health crisis, but because we think we could live differently and along with our neighbors.
Joey, did you have something you wanted to? Okay, I just didn't know if I saw your hand.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. The next question is, there will be concerted opposition to this transformation from powerful people who control limited resources. How do we get to social commons from here?
So I'll start with that one. I am very concerned about power relations, but I do think that both David and Peter have said we have hit a historical moment, and the conditions of life on our planet, both our social life as unraveled by the pandemic, COVID-19, but also our knowledge of what we're doing to Mother Earth. And the fact that if together as peoples, we don't pressure to change, and how we organize our social movements and how they begin to pressure for that change won't be stopped this time. You know, I saw it stopped in Latin America with dictatorships, with structural adjustments, but I think the knowledge that we have a short period of time to save our lives on this planet will push us into new ways of thinking more rapidly, more courage to stand up. Neoliberalism and the present organization of capital will not go into the dark easily, but it has to go, or life on this planet as any of us know it will no longer exist.
Yeah, and I noticed one thing that underlies all of this. I noticed Lynn in the comments section talks about we have to be realistic and influence our policy and get the kind of government we want, proposing proportional representation as a way to get our democratic accountability in our governments, as opposed to kind of the first past the post system. And I think that's true. We need democratic reform, but we not only need it in our institutions, we need it at the ground level in how our decisions are made among ourselves, how our city councilors make decisions, our boards of education. We need to revitalize and rediscover democracy on whatever issue you want to work on. The question is, who has the power? And that's the target. Who in the community is concerned about this issue? How do we work together to influence that person who has the power? And how do we make sure we don't just win the issue, but we set up some ongoing processes and structures so our voice is always heard, rather than us discovering the need to express it. So I think democracy has to be recreated, and proportional representation around one of our key institutions is important, but on the ground democracy, I think, as David is pointing out in his piece there, is really, really critical.
I think if you just add one thing quickly, we have gone through a period since the early 90s in particular, where we feel defeated, where we've been up against it many, many times and been unsuccessful. That creates a certain resignation. And I think one of the really powerful things in the last couple of years, we kind of turned into that, for those who are movie buffs, we kind of turned into that Peter Finch character in Network that just basically goes to the window and says, I'm mad as hell, I'm not going to take it anymore. And a lot of people are open to having larger conversations about what is possible and what isn't possible. And if we start from the premise, they won't let us do it, the first question is, who's they? And the systems that we've created, we created through governments. They didn't just sort of magically appear. And so because we the people at some level, we do have the ability collectively, if we believe in something strongly enough, to shift the thinking at a political level. And that has happened before. It's a lot of work. It takes years. But I think a lot of the things we assume can't be done actually can be done.
Okay, thank you. Currently, many of us are struggling with how to integrate an equity and diversity lens into the work that we do at a community level. Could the panel offer some suggestions on how we can expand this dimension for work at the SPC level? Thank you. That's Social Planning Council levels at SPC. I know you know that. I just realized I used it for other people who might not.
Well, that's a good question, and I do think that's one question where we need really to get into more than just the rhetoric and the language. We definitely need to study what that means and to hear from the people who are most involved, and to actually listen carefully around ways in which people from marginalized or diverse and racialized communities think they are not adequately included in some of the mainstream institutions and organizations. I think the first thing is active. I know more and more as I look into the nonprofit sector. I'm kind of not really directly engaged in a professional capacity in it right now, that there's more attention to actually creating supporting boards that are governed by a more diverse population, part of the population, than certainly the social planning councils of the 70s and 80s when I was coming in. That we have the leadership, and we have skilled leadership, and I think we have to follow their leadership around how to actually make sure that it's not just about governance, but it's about program and program delivery and policy that's developed. And I do think there's been progress, but I think it's evident that it hasn't been enough.
Okay. Okay, can I move on? Okay. How do we get corporations to adapt models like in Germany and Sweden, where CEOs make no more than 11 times what laborers do and corporate directors make less than the CEO?
Right.
So it's very interesting. I'll just respond a little bit. I remember in some of the areas working in social protection, you would bring the European models as examples of what could be done in Canada. And without deep conversation, without looking at the evidence, there was a tendency, and I still think that exists, for us to think that we're a special nation. We're a nation of fundamentally good people, and we do good things. And there was a rejection in the community I worked in to enter into those dialogues, to look at Swedish models of social services or Norwegian models. And I think that's changed now too. I think that part of the dialogue of moving to a better world, a better society, is to look at what's really worked well, that's created greater justice, greater equality, greater access, respect for diversity in all those other places, and for us to incorporate them and make them ours where appropriate. I think that we are not the great place we think we are as we close our eyes to the rest of the world and to good thinking.
I think most progressive economists right now are realizing that we've argued for years on, that it's not a deficit problem around social services, it's a revenue problem, and talked about more progressive income taxes and that kind of thing. More and more are recognizing that at least a first step towards the kind of system we need is a wealth tax, not just an income tax. And we nibble at the edges when we talk about over 200 million or 20 million, whatever it is, 1% or 2%. Maybe we start there, but let's face it, if you're going to talk about real redistribution, people making that level of income have more than enough to live a really good life. And the question is, what do we expect of them in terms of helping those who don't have enough, as well as what is our right to get access, or not ours, so much mine as people at the bottom, what is their right to get access to resources to be able to have a good life? Thomas Piketty talks about a wealth tax, Mariana Mazzucato, Stephanie Kelton, Kate Raworth, mostly they're all women, notice. And that's essentially that we got to.
But I found it interesting, Peter. I found it interesting in the last couple of days, the Globe and Mail, in terms of looking at the federal budget, cited the NDP's proposal on a wealth tax and said it was a good idea. There's a Globe and Mail.
I think some corporate leaders have agreed that it's a good idea. I think,
right.
Yeah, so maybe there's hope to get a wedge in the door there.
Yeah.
That goes back to your moment in time comment earlier. Okay, last question, and we're like about 2 or 3 minutes before we need to begin our wrap up. I am curious about long-term care. Government seems so entrenched in building larger long-term care facilities with setting up smaller units inside, but with little or no outside exposure. How do we get them off this trend into the smaller cooperative type living? I think this incorporates many of the dimensions of the social commons.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Peter.
well, I basically suggested what I thought needed to be done. And I think there are a lot of organizations led by elder people themselves, but also looking for more and more allies. I would say if you really want to get involved in this issue, the most active group right now that I know of that I try to participate in is the Seniors for Social Action Ontario. They got an excellent website. They got excellent position papers. They write, anytime this issue comes up, if you look in the letters to the editor, 40% of the letters are from people in this community who are writing in support of the kind of principles that the questioner is raising. So find a group like that, and they get more than enough energy and hope out of working with them.
If I could just add one thing to that, I think
Please.
the other piece of this is we've invested political capital, not we, but the governments, in investing in these large institutions and these larger corporations actually sort of buying up the smaller mom and pop shops, and they've all been turned into what are called REITs. So first and foremost, most of our larger long-term care homes are an investment vehicle for shareholders. Secondarily, they're an individual corporate entity. And at the third level down, they're a service provider and houser of old, frail people. So I think what needs to happen as part of the strategy is a frontal attack on that as a model of care, because if we don't attack that hard and deep and make any government unable to say, this is something I can condone and support, it's not going to make the shift it needs to make.
Again, Joey, I didn't know if you were.
No, I would just add one thing to that. I believe that the creation of long-term care as we know it in this Canada is a fundamental violation of the rights of older people. And I think it is fundamentally based in our own ageism. It doesn't fit, again, with our image of what we are as, or should be as an individual in a society. I would remind people listening that there was a book written by a lawyer out of York, 1979, where he talked about these institutions as warehouses of death. So think now, 2020, 2021, warehouses of death. So think it was a conscious step, and we allowed the dehumanization of our elderly, and we allowed the privatization and the investments that David talked about. So I'll end on that.
Okay, that is exactly on time. Thank you so much for that. We're down to our last 2 minutes, so it's my job to do a little bit of a wrap up. And of course, first, Joey and David and Peter, thank you so much for the insights that you have shared tonight, and for providing us with a lot to think about and act upon, I think, as we go forward on this journey, trying to create this world that you talked about, where we live and share together and everybody prospers and does well. So we hope, panelists and also the people who are here as participants, that there will be a part 2 to this conversation. So please stay tuned for that. We'll work on it. As you know, this event was recorded, and so we will be following up with all of the participants to provide you with that link, and also a link that would allow you to contact our panelists if you wish further information. And they have a website that has a lot of information on it that you, I'm sure, would find interesting and helpful. Thank you again to Kirsten, Samantha, and Jillian for keeping us all connected and on track. And I'm going to be finishing on time too, which is also a wonderful thing. But especially I want to thank all of you for sharing part of your evening with us tonight. We appreciate your interactions. We look forward to the work that we can do together to create a society that is as equity and justice and shared opportunity for all of us. So thank you very much for being here with us tonight, and keep safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.